It was a cold autumn night in Ravenswood, a small town in the heart of Ohio. The wind howled fiercely, making the dry leaves dance across the deserted streets. The packaging factory, located on the outskirts of town, was the only place still, lit at that hour. Its name, Ravenswood Packaging, was written in faded letters on the rusted sign at the entrance. Most of the townsfolk avoided passing by there at night, especially after the stories that circulated about the place. I, Jonathan, was one of the night shift workers. I had started working there 3 months ago after losing my previous job. The pay was decent, and I needed the money to pay the bills. That night, as usual, I arrived at 10 p.m. for my shift, which would last until 6 a.m. The parking lot was almost empty, with only a few cars scattered around. The air felt heavier than usual, as if something was looming over the place. As I entered the factory, I greeted the security guard, an elderly man named Frank, who always seemed on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He handed me my badge with a tense smile and muttered, "Be careful tonight, Jonathan. It feels strange." I laughed, trying to mask the discomfort his words caused. Frank always said things like that, but that night his voice sounded more serious. The interior of the factory was lit by flickering fluorescent lights that cast strange shadows on the walls. The hum of the machines was constant, a low buzz that seemed to echo in my head. My workstation was in the packaging section, where I supervised a production line that packed cardboard boxes. It was monotonous work, but I was used to it. Around midnight, something began to change. The machines, which usually ran smoothly, started to malfunction. The noise grew louder, almost deafening, and the lights flickered more frequently. My coworkers, who usually chatted during the shift, became strangely quiet. I looked around and noticed that everyone had tense expressions, as if they were waiting for something to happen. That's when I heard the first sound, a low moan, coming from somewhere deep within the factory. It sounded human, but at the same time, it didn't. My heart raced, and I glanced at my coworker, Mike, who was standing beside me. He had heard it too. "What was that?" he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. I didn't have an answer. The moan came again, louder this time, and it seemed to be getting closer. I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and headed in the direction of the sound, with Mike hesitantly following me. The hallway leading to the storage area was dark, with only the faint beam of the flashlight illuminating the path. The air was icy, and I could see my breath forming small clouds of vapor. The moan stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then suddenly, I heard footsteps behind us. I spun around, pointing the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but there was no one there. "Let's go back," Mike said, his voice trembling. I agreed, but before we could move, something hit us. An invisible force pushed us against the wall, and the flashlight fell to the ground, extinguishing its light. We were left in the dark, hearing only the sound of our ragged breathing. Then a voice whispered in our ears, so low we could barely make it out. "You shouldn't be here," Mike screamed, and we ran back to the packaging section, where the other workers looked at us with panic-stricken expressions. "What happened?" one of the women asked, her voice trembling. I didn't know how to respond. Something was wrong in that factory, and I had no idea what it was. After the incident in the hallway, the atmosphere in the factory grew even tenser. The machines continued to malfunction, and the lights flickered irregularly, creating a sense of disorientation. The workers who had previously tried to ignore their fear were now clearly terrified. Some whispered among themselves, while others simply stood still, looking around as if they expected something horrible to happen at any moment. Mike and I tried to focus on our work, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then, I would glance over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone, but there were only shadows moving on the walls. The moan we had heard earlier didn't repeat, but the silence was almost worse. It was a heavy silence, as if the air was filled with something we couldn't see. Around 2 a.m., something truly strange happened. The machines stopped working abruptly, and the lights went out completely. We were left in total darkness, and the silence was absolute. Someone turned on a flashlight, and the flickering light illuminated the pale, frightened faces of the workers. "What's going on?" Someone asked, but no one had an answer. That's when we heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and heavy, as if someone was dragging their feet across the floor. The sound grew closer, and I felt my heart beat faster. "Frank?" someone called, hoping it was the security guard, but there was no response. The footsteps stopped, just outside the door to the packaging section, and we all froze, waiting. The door creaked open slowly, its rusty hinges groaning. The flashlight was pointed toward the entrance, but there was no one there. Only a thick fog began to spread across the floor, advancing toward us. "What is that?" Mike whispered, his voice filled with panic. No one answered. The fog seemed alive, moving almost intentionally, and I felt an intense cold run through my body. Suddenly the lights came back on, and the machines turned on by themselves, making everyone jump in fright. The fog disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but the feeling of fear remained. "This isn't normal," one of the women said, her voice trembling. "Something is very wrong here." We decided to stick together, working in groups to try to feel safer. But the fear didn't go away. Every now and then, I would see something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving too fast to be human. Others reported feeling cold touches on their shoulders or hearing whispers in their ears. The factory seemed to be alive, and it didn't want us there. Around 4 a.m. the worst happened. One of the workers, a man named Tom, started acting strangely. He stopped working and just stood there, staring into nothing. "Tom?" I called, but he didn't respond. Then he started laughing. It was a low, joyless laugh that soon turned into a maniacal cackle. "He's possessed!" someone shouted, and everyone backed away. Tom stopped laughing abruptly and looked directly at me. His eyes were completely black, with no whites visible. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice distorted and guttural. Then he collapsed to the floor unconscious. We rushed to help him, but when he woke up, he didn't remember anything. "What happened?" he asked, confused. No one could explain it, but we all knew something was very wrong. The factory seemed to be consuming us, and I had no idea how to escape. The shift wasn't over yet, and I didn't know if we could make it until dawn. The incident with Tom left everyone in shock. He was taken to the break room, where we tried to calm him down, but he kept trembling and muttering unintelligible things. The rest of us returned to work, but the tension was palpable. The machines continued to malfunction, and the lights flickered irregularly, creating a sense of despair. I couldn't concentrate, and my eyes were constantly searching for something. Anything that could explain what was happening. Around 5 a.m. the sun still hadn't risen, and the darkness outside the factory seemed even denser. The wind howled outside, and the windows rattled with the force of the gusts. That's when we heard the sound of knocking on the main door. We all looked at each other, hesitant. "Who could it be at this hour?" Mike asked, his voice filled with fear. Frank, the security guard, went to the door and looked through the peephole. He stood still for a moment, then turned to us with a look of terror. "There's no one there," he said, his voice trembling. The knocking continued, growing louder, as if someone was trying to break down the door. "What are we going to do?" someone asked, but no one had an answer. Suddenly, the knocking stopped, and the silence returned. We all stood still, waiting for something to happen. Then we heard the sound of laughter coming from the hallway. It was a low, evil laugh that seemed to come from all directions at once. "This isn't real," I thought, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But when I looked around, I saw that everyone else was hearing the same thing. The door to the packaging section creaked open slowly, and the fog we had seen before began to spread across the floor again. This time it seemed denser, more alive. "We can't stay here!" Mike shouted, and we all agreed. We ran toward the exit, but the fog surrounded us, blocking our path. It was as if it was pushing us back into the factory. "What do you want from us?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty space. The answer came in the form of whispers, low voices that seemed to come from all around. "You shouldn't be here," they said, repeating the same phrase we had heard before. The fog began to close in around us, and I felt an intense cold run through my body. That's when I saw something moving in the fog. It was a tall, dark figure with glowing eyes that seemed to stare directly at us. It approached slowly, and I felt a wave of pure terror wash over me. "This can't be happening," I thought, but I knew it was real. The figure reached out its hand, and I felt an invisible force pulling me toward it. "Jonathan," Mike shouted, trying to pull me back, but the force was too strong. I was being dragged into the fog, and I knew that if I entered, I would never come out. With one last effort, I managed to break free and ran toward the exit with Mike and the others behind me. The fog tried to follow us, but somehow we made it to the parking lot. The sun was beginning to rise, and the light of day dispelled the fog. We looked back at the factory and saw that it seemed normal again, but we knew something horrible had happened inside. "I'm never going back there," Mike said, his voice filled with relief and fear. I agreed. I would never set foot in that factory again. But even so, I knew that night would never leave my mind. Something in that factory was alive, and it didn't want us there. And I had no idea what it was, or what might happen to anyone who decided to return. After that night, none of us went back to the factory. Mike, Tom, and the other night shift workers quit the next day, as did I. Frank, the security guard, disappeared without a trace. No one knew where he went, but we all suspected he had been taken by that thing that inhabited the factory. The police were called, but they found nothing wrong. The factory continued to operate, with new workers being hired for the night shift. But I knew something was wrong. A few weeks later, I started hearing stories. Stories of workers disappearing during the night shift, of machines operating on their own, of voices and laughter echoing through the empty halls. The factory was gaining a sinister reputation, and the people of Ravenswood began to avoid it. But the worst was yet to come. One night, I decided to investigate. I couldn't stop thinking about that night, about that thing that had almost taken me. I grabbed a flashlight and returned to the factory, determined to uncover the truth. The parking lot was empty and the factory seemed abandoned. The lights were off and the silence was absolute. I entered through the back door, which was unlocked, and began exploring the interior. Everything seemed normal, but I knew something was wrong. The machines were covered in dust, as if they hadn't been used in months. But I knew the factory was still operating. Then I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, pointing the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty space. There was no response. Then I heard the sound of laughter, the same laughter we had heard that night. It came from all around, and I felt a wave of pure terror wash over me. I ran toward the exit, but the fog began to spread across the floor, blocking my path. "You shouldn't be here," a voice whispered in my ear. I spun around again and saw the dark figure approaching. This time, it was closer, and I could see its glowing eyes fixed on me. "What do you want?" I shouted, trying to stand my ground. The figure stopped and reached out its hand, as if inviting me to follow. I knew that if I did, I would never return. But at the same time, I felt a morbid curiosity. What was in that factory? What did that thing want? I decided to follow the figure, the flashlight trembling in my hand. It led me to the storage area where there was a door I had never seen before. The figure pointed to the door, and I knew I was supposed to open it. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door and stepped inside. What I saw inside left me in shock. It was a room filled with old photos and documents detailing the history of the factory. There were pictures of workers who had disappeared over the years, of unexplained accidents, of things no one had ever explained. And in the center of the room there was a strange symbol drawn on the floor, surrounded by extinguished candles. That's when I realized it. The factory wasn't just a scary place, it was a portal, a place where something from the other side could enter our world. And that thing, that dark figure, was the guardian of the portal. It didn't want us there because it knew that if we discovered the truth, we could close the portal. But it was too late. The figure was behind me, and I knew there was no escape. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered again, and I felt an invisible force pulling me toward it. I tried to fight, but the force was too strong. I was being dragged into the portal, and I knew that if I entered, I would never come out. With one last effort, I managed to break free and ran toward the exit. The figure tried to follow, but I escaped. I left the factory and never went back. But even so, I knew that thing was still there, waiting for its next victim. The factory was shut down a few months later after a series of unexplained disappearances. The place was abandoned and no one ever dared to enter again. But I know that portal is still open, and that thing is still waiting. Years have passed since that night, but what happened at the Ravenswood factory never left my mind. The town, once quiet and peaceful, began to change. People avoided talking about the factory, but everyone knew something was wrong. Stories of apparitions, strange sounds, and disappearances continued to circulate, and the site was fenced off with barbed wire with no trespassing signs scattered everywhere. I moved to another town, trying to leave the past behind, but the fear never left me. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that dark figure and the fog that seemed alive. Mike, my co-worker from that night, also moved away, but he was never the same. He told me that sometimes he still heard laughter and whispers, even far from the factory. Tom, the man who had been possessed, disappeared without a trace a few months later. No one knew where he went, but I had my suspicions. One day, I received a call from an investigative reporter named David. He was writing a book about haunted places in the United States and had heard about the Ravenswood factory. He wanted to know if I was willing to share my story. I hesitated at first, but I decided it was time to face my demons. I agreed to meet him at a cafe in a nearby town. David was a young, energetic man, but I could see the seriousness in his eyes as we began to talk. I told him everything that had happened that night, from the moans in the hallway to the dark figure and the portal in the storage room. He listened intently, taking notes in his notebook. When I finished, he was silent for a moment, as if processing everything. "This is incredible," he finally said. "Do you think there's still something there?" I hesitated before answering. "I don't know, but I wouldn't risk finding out." David decided to investigate on his own. He visited Ravenswood and spoke to the townsfolk who were reluctant to talk about the factory. Some told stories of strange lights at night, of the sound of machines running even when the factory was closed, and of a fog that sometimes appeared around the site. He also discovered that the factory had been built on top of an old Native American burial ground, which explained part of the mystery. Determined to uncover the truth, David decided to enter the factory. He called me the night he planned to do it, asking for my blessing. I tried to dissuade him, but he was determined. "If there's something there, the world needs to know," he said. The next morning, David disappeared. His team found his car parked outside the factory, but there was no sign of him. The police were called, but they found nothing. The factory was empty, as always. But I knew what had happened. That thing had taken him. David's book was never published, but his investigation left a legacy. The Ravenswood factory was demolished a few years later, and the land was turned into a park. But I know the portal is still there, buried beneath the earth. And I know that thing is still waiting, ready to take anyone who dares to get too close. To this day, I wonder if I did the right thing by telling my story. Maybe I should have let the past stay buried. But at the same time, I know the world needs to know. There are things in this world we can't explain, and there are places where evil is still alive. And the Ravenswood factory was one of those places. I never went back there, and I never will. But sometimes, when the wind blows hard and the shadows seem to move on their own, I still feel that cold in the depths of my soul. And I know that thing is still there, waiting. The demolition of the Ravenswood factory brought temporary relief to the town, but the evil that inhabited that place didn't go away. The park that was built on the site seemed peaceful at first glance, but the residents soon began to notice strange things. Children played and laughed during the day, but at night the park became deserted. People reported feeling a presence watching them, even when they were alone. Some said they heard faint laughter and whispers coming from the trees, while others swore they had seen a thick fog forming in certain areas of the park. I, Jonathan, continued my life away from Ravenswood, but the past always haunted me. I got married, had children, and tried to move on. But the memories of that night never left me. I knew the portal was still there, buried beneath the park, and that thing was still waiting. Years went by, and I thought perhaps the evil had been contained. But then, one night I received a call from Mike, my old co-worker. His voice was trembling, and he sounded desperate. "Jonathan, you need to come here. Something is happening in the park, something horrible." I hesitated. I didn't want to go back to Ravenswood, but I knew I couldn't ignore Mike's plea. I grabbed my car and drove to the town, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, Mike was waiting for me at the entrance of the park. He looked aged, with sunken eyes and a look of panic. "What's happening?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "You need to see for yourself," he replied, leading me into the park. The park was dark, with only the moonlight illuminating the path. The air was cold, and I could feel a strange energy around me. Mike took me to a spot where the grass was burned, forming a perfect circle. In the center of the circle, there was a hole in the ground, and a thick fog was rising from it. "The portal," I whispered, feeling a wave of terror wash over me. "It's open." Mike nodded. "I've seen things, Jonathan, things I can't explain. And I've heard voices whispering my name. I know that thing is trying to come out." We stood there, staring at the hole, unsure of what to do. We knew we couldn't close the portal on our own, but we also knew we couldn't leave it open. It was then that we heard the sound of laughter, the same laughter we had heard that night at the factory. The fog began to spread, and I saw the dark figure emerging from the hole. "You shouldn't be here," the figure whispered, its voice distorted and guttural. Mike and I ran, but the fog surrounded us, blocking our way. The figure approached, and I felt an invisible force pulling me toward it. I tried to fight, but the force was too strong. I was being dragged into the portal, and I knew that if I entered, I would never come out. With one last effort, I managed to break free and ran toward the exit. Mike was behind me, but the fog caught him. I saw him being pulled into the hole, his expression of terror frozen on his face. "Jonathan!" he screamed, but I couldn't help him. The fog swallowed him, and he disappeared. I ran to my car and drove away from the park, my heart racing in my chest. I knew Mike was lost, and that thing was still there, waiting. The next day, the hole in the park was closed, and the authorities said it was just an accident. But I knew the truth. The portal was still there, and that thing was still waiting. I never returned to Ravenswood, and I never will. But sometimes, when the wind blows hard and the shadows seem to move on their own, I still feel that chill deep in my soul. And I know that thing is still there, waiting. And now, I tell my story to you, hoping that you will never go near that place. Because there are things in this world that we cannot explain, and there are places where evil is still alive. And the park in Ravenswood is one of those places.